The radio crackled with static, then silence. 300 meters below the Afghan ridgeline, 8 Navy SEALs pressed their backs against jagged limestone, sweat mixing with dust on their faces. Team leader Marcus Reaper Valdez keyed his comms twice, the universal signal for immediate extraction. Nothing. The Taliban had them pinned in a natural bowl, high-velocity rounds chipping away at their meager cover with methodical precision. "Contact lost with Overlord," whispered the radio man, his voice barely audible over the crescendo of AK-47 fire. Valdez's jaw tightened. They'd been tracking a high-value target for 72 hours through these godforsaken mountains, and now the hunters had become the hunted. The enemy held the high ground on 3 sides, funneling the Americans into an increasingly narrow kill zone. Then something impossible happened. A single green flare arced across the dawn sky, its phosphorus trail forming a perfect figure eight before dissolving into smoke. The Taliban fire ceased immediately, as if someone had thrown a switch. In the eerie quiet that followed, even the mountain wind seemed to hold its breath. Valdez had seen that pattern before, burned into his memory from a briefing 3 years ago. The Infinity Loop, a call sign so classified that speaking it aloud was a court-martial offense. But everyone in special operations whispered the legend. A ghost pilot who'd vanished after a mission gone wrong in Syria, leaving behind only rumors and a service record sealed so deep that even Pentagon insiders claimed it didn't exist. The flare meant one thing: hold position and wait. But wait for what? The official story was that the pilot behind that call sign had died in a helicopter crash, taking her secrets to an unmarked grave. Yet here was her signature, painted in fire against the Afghan sky. "Movement 2 o'clock," hissed the sniper. Through his scope, he caught a glimpse of rotor blades cutting through the morning haze. Not the familiar silhouette of their expected Chinook extraction, but something sleeker. Something that shouldn't exist in this theater of operations. The helicopter materialized like a predator emerging from shadow, a modified Black Hawk with stealth configurations that belonged in a think tank, not a combat zone. Its approach was silent, almost supernatural, hugging the terrain with precision that defied both physics and military doctrine. As the aircraft settled into a hover 50 meters away, the side door slid open. A figure in pilot gear leaned out, face obscured by a helmet and tinted visor. But Valdez could see enough. The weathered flight suit, the confident posture, the way she held the controls like an extension of her own nervous system. The Infinity Loop had returned from the dead. Valdez grabbed his gear and sprinted towards salvation, his team close behind. But as they reached the helicopter's door, he caught sight of something that made his blood freeze. Painted on the aircraft's nose, barely visible beneath layers of desert camouflage, was a symbol he'd hoped never to see again: the coiled serpent of Unit Designation Null. The helicopter's engines screamed to life, drowning out the returning Taliban gunfire. As they lifted off into the crimson dawn, Valdez realized they weren't being rescued. They were being recruited into something far more dangerous than anything they'd left behind on that mountain. The pilot's voice crackled through their headsets, distorted by encryption software that turned human speech into digital ghost talk. "Welcome to the real war, gentlemen. My name is Captain Lyra Thorne, and officially I don't exist." Through the aircraft's armored windows, Valdez watched the mountains shrink beneath them. But instead of heading toward their forward operating base, they were flying deeper into the wilderness, toward coordinates that didn't appear on any map. He tried to key his radio to contact command to signal their position. Dead air. Whatever technology powered this aircraft had severed all outside communication. "Where are you taking us?" he demanded, his voice barely audible over the rotor wash. Thorne's helmet turned slightly, catching his reflection in her visor. "Somewhere safe, somewhere they can't follow us." "They? Who's they?" "The same people who sent you on a mission, designed to get you killed." The words hit Valdez like a physical blow. He'd suspected something was wrong about their intelligence, the convenient timing of their supposed high-value target. But hearing it confirmed by a ghost pilot in an aircraft that shouldn't exist made his world tilt on its axis. "You have 30 seconds to decide," Thorne continued, her voice steady despite the helicopter's violent maneuvering through the mountain passes. "Stay dead, or learn the truth about why your government wanted you that way." Below them, the landscape shifted from barren peaks to hidden valleys that seemed untouched by war. Ancient irrigation channels carved geometric patterns into terraced hillsides, and Valdez caught glimpses of structures that looked more like research facilities than military installations. "This is insane," muttered his second-in-command, a grizzled veteran named Patterson who'd survived 3 deployments without blinking. But even Patterson's voice carried a note of uncertainty that Valdez had never heard before. The helicopter began its descent toward a compound that materialized from the landscape like a mirage becoming solid. Guard towers that looked like they belonged in a different century flanked modern satellite arrays. Armed figures in non-standard uniforms moved with the precision of elite soldiers, but their patches bore no national insignia. As they touched down on a landing pad marked only with the same serpent symbol from the aircraft's nose, Thorne finally removed her helmet. The face that emerged was younger than her voice suggested, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too much. Scars traced delicate patterns across her left cheek, the kind left by shrapnel that had missed vital organs by millimeters. "Captain Lyra Infinity Thorne," she said, extending a gloved hand. "And before you ask, yes, I died in Syria, officially. The woman standing in front of you is something else entirely." Valdez hesitated before taking her hand. Her grip was firm, calloused from years of stick-and-rudder flying. But there was something else in her touch, a tremor so slight it might have been imagination, the kind that came from carrying secrets too heavy for one person to bear. "What is this place?" he asked. "The last honest corner of the war machine," Thorne replied. "A place where soldiers who have seen too much come to remember what they're really fighting for." She led them through corridors that hummed with activity. Analysts pored over intelligence that looked current. Technicians maintained equipment that seemed decades ahead of standard military issue. Everyone they passed wore the same unmarked uniforms, the same expression of quiet purpose. "Unit designation null," Thorne explained as they walked. "We don't exist on any organizational chart, don't answer to any chain of command that you'd recognize. Our mandate is simple: identify and eliminate threats to American interests that are too sensitive for official channels." "Sounds like CIA wet work," Patterson grunted. Thorne's laugh was bitter. "The CIA answers to politicians. Politicians answer to interests that aren't always American. We answer to something simpler, the Constitution we swore to defend, even when defending it means working outside the system." They entered a briefing room where walls lined with monitors displayed real-time intelligence from around the globe. Valdez recognized some of the locations: Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia. But others were domestic American cities that shouldn't appear on military targeting displays. "The mission that got you surrounded wasn't about capturing a terrorist leader," Thorne said, activating a presentation that made Valdez's stomach drop. "It was about eliminating witnesses to Operation Blackwater's true scope." The screens showed financial transfers, weapons shipments, communications between American officials and insurgent groups, evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, a shadow war being fought not against America's enemies, but against America itself. "Your unit stumbled onto something bigger than Afghanistan," Thorne continued. "Something that certain people in Washington would kill to keep secret. So they sent you on a suicide mission disguised as routine reconnaissance." Valdez studied the evidence with the analytical mind that had kept him alive through 4 combat deployments. The documentation was thorough, cross-referenced, undeniable. But accepting its truth meant accepting that everything he'd fought for had been corrupted from within. "Why save us?" he asked. "What do you want?" "I want what every soldier wants," Thorne replied. "To come home from a war that makes sense." She walked to the room's only window, which looked out over the hidden valley. In the distance, aircraft moved with purpose between camouflaged hangars, maintaining the tools of a private war. "I've been fighting this shadow conflict for 3 years, ever since my death in Syria. Gathering intelligence, building assets, trying to understand how deep the rot goes. The answer is, deeper than you can imagine." She turned back to face them, and Valdez saw something in her eyes that he recognized, the look of a soldier who'd found an enemy worth the sacrifice. "I'm offering you a choice, Marcus. You and your men can walk away from this. New identities, clean papers, enough money to disappear anywhere in the world. Or you can join the real fight, the one that actually matters." The room fell silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant sound of aircraft engines. Valdez looked at his team, saw the same conflict in their faces that he felt in his chest. They'd signed up to defend their country, not to discover that their country was at war with itself. "What would we be signing up for?" he asked. "Truth," Thorne replied simply. "However much it hurts, however much it costs." Outside the window, the sun was setting over the hidden valley, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. Somewhere in that light, Valdez thought he could see the ghost of the America he'd believed in, the one he'd been willing to die for. The decision, when it came, felt like falling. "Where do we start?" he said. Thorne smiled for the first time since they'd met, and in that expression was both relief and terrible anticipation. "With the truth about why I had to die to keep fighting for my country." The briefing that followed would reshape everything Valdez thought he knew about war, loyalty, and the price of serving something greater than yourself. But first, Thorne had a story to tell, a story that began 2 years earlier, in the skis over Syria, when Captain Lyra Thorne learned that sometimes the most dangerous enemy wears the same flag you do. The monitors around them flickered to life, displaying classified footage that officially didn't exist. In the grainy images, a Black Hawk helicopter burned in the Syrian desert while figures in American uniforms watched from a safe distance, making no attempt at rescue. "This is how I died," Thorne said quietly. "Shot down not by enemy fire, but by a Hellfire missile launched from an American drone. The pilot who fired that missile thought he was eliminating a security risk. He had no idea he was creating something far more dangerous." The footage showed a figure crawling from the wreckage, badly wounded but alive. Lyra Thorne, presumed dead, beginning the long journey that would transform her from decorated pilot to ghost operative. "They tried to bury me along with the evidence I'd gathered. Instead, they taught me how to fight a different kind of war." Valdez found himself leaning forward, drawn into a story that redefined everything he thought he knew about service and sacrifice. "The mission brief was standard," Thorne continued, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of 1,000 after-action reports. "Transport a high-value informant from a compromised safe house to Extraction Point Bravo. Routine milk run, they called it. The kind of mission they give to pilots who have been asking too many questions." The screen shifted to display personnel files, communications logs, operational timelines. The mundane paperwork of military bureaucracy, but Valdez had learned to read between the lines. The informant was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a defense intelligence analyst who'd uncovered financial irregularities in our weapons transfer programs. Money disappearing, equipment ending up in the wrong hands, American weapons being used against American forces. Thorne paused, her fingers tracing the scars on her face with unconscious precision. Vasquez had 48 hours of intercepted communications that proved American officials were selling weapons to both sides of the conflict. Not just corruption, treason on a scale that would destabilize 3 governments. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees as the implications sank in. Valdez had seen enough war to know that bullets were cheaper than loyalty, but this went beyond individual corruption into something systematic. 20 minutes from the extraction point, I received new orders. Divert to coordinates that weren't on any map for a briefing that wasn't in any database. I should have known then, should have recognized the setup, but I was a good soldier. I followed orders. The footage showed her helicopter changing course, flying toward a barren stretch of desert where nothing moved except shadows and wind. The hellfire came from our own drone, Coulson Guardian Angel. Friendly fire, they'd call it later, pilot error, mechanical malfunction, the kind of accidents that happen in a complicated war. But the video evidence told a different story. Frame by frame, Thorne walked them through the attack, pointing out the deliberate targeting, the calculated distance, the moment when her Black Hawk became a tomb for secrets too dangerous to survive. Dr. Vasquez died on impact. I should have died with her. Sometimes I think that would have been simpler. Instead, Thorne had crawled from the wreckage with degree burns, 2 broken ribs, and a head injury that left her unconscious for 3 days in the Syrian desert. When she finally reached friendly forces, she discovered that Captain Lyra Thorne was already dead, memorialized in a ceremony she watched on stolen satellite television. "They gave me a Bronze Star posthumously," she said with bitter humor, "for service above and beyond the call of duty." The irony was perfect. The official story was clean. Helicopter mechanical failure, no survivors, remains recovered and returned to family. But unofficial stories were harder to control, and rumors began spreading through the pilot community about Guardian Angel's true purpose. It took me 6 months to piece together the network. Defense contractors with ties to insurgent groups, Pentagon officials with Swiss bank accounts, politicians who voted for wars that fed their portfolios. A shadow economy built on American blood. She'd spent another year gathering evidence, building a case that could bring down the conspiracy. But every attempt to contact official channels ended the same way: ignored, dismissed, or quietly transferred to different commands. The system wasn't broken, Thorne realized. It was working exactly as designed. For certain people, war wasn't hell. It was the most profitable business on Earth. So she'd gone underground, using skills learned in military intelligence to become something the Pentagon had never trained her for: a domestic operative working against her own government's corruption. Unit designation Null began as one woman with a grudge and a stolen laptop. Now we're 47 operators working in 12 countries, with assets inside every major defense contractor and most congressional intelligence committees. Valdez absorbed this information with the clinical detachment of a professional soldier, but part of him was recoiling from implications too vast to fully comprehend. "You're talking about overthrowing the government." "I'm talking about saving it," Thorne corrected. "There's a difference between America and the people who have hijacked American foreign policy for personal gain. Sometimes protecting one means working against the other." The monitors around them displayed a web of connections so complex it looked like abstract art. Financial transfers, communication intercepts, travel records, weapons shipments. The visual representation of a conspiracy that spanned decades and reached into institutions Valdez had trusted his entire adult life. "Your mission in Afghanistan wasn't random," Thorne continued. "Your team had been asking questions about missing equipment, weapons that disappeared from supply convoys. Someone noticed, and someone decided you were becoming a liability." She pulled up their operational history, cross-referenced with the same financial networks that had gotten Dr. Vasquez killed. 3 months ago, you reported discrepancies in ammunition supplies. 2 months ago, you questioned why certain high-value targets always seemed to know when raids were coming. Last month, you filed a formal complaint about intelligence that led your team into 3 separate ambushes. The pattern was undeniable. Each time Valdez and his men had gotten close to exposing the network, they'd been sent on increasingly dangerous missions, as if someone was trying to solve a problem through statistical probability. The Taliban didn't surround you by accident, Thorne said quietly. They had your exact route, your timing, your radio frequencies. Someone wanted that mountain to be your grave. Patterson, who'd been silent through the briefing, finally spoke. Why didn't they just transfer us, or discharge us? Why try to kill us? Because you'd seen too much and dead men tell no tales. Plus, your deaths would have been useful, more evidence that the war was escalating, justification for the weapons contracts that keep certain people wealthy. The cynicism of it was breathtaking. American soldiers being deliberately sacrificed not for strategic advantage, but for quarterly earnings reports. We have a choice, Thorne said, returning to the window. We can pretend this conversation never happened. I can arrange new identities for all of you, places where the network can't reach. You can live out your lives knowing the truth but choosing to ignore it. She paused, watching aircraft move through the twilight like mechanical birds seeking shelter. Or we can fight back, not with protests or political campaigns, but with the tools we know best. Direct action against targets that deserve it, intelligence operations that expose what needs exposing, and when necessary, permanent solutions to permanent problems. Valdez looked at his men, reading the conflict in faces he'd trusted through years of combat. They'd signed up to defend America, not to discover that America needed defending from itself. What's the mission? He asked. Thorne smiled grimly. Tonight we're going to steal a war. The operation began 6 hours later, with 3 unmarked helicopters lifting off from the hidden valley under cover of darkness. Thorne piloted the lead aircraft with the fluid precision that had made her legendary before her official death, while Valdez and his team prepared for an insertion that would either expose the conspiracy or get them all killed. Their target, a classified facility in Nevada where defense contractors tested weapons destined for foreign conflicts. Intelligence suggested the facility was being used to demonstrate American military capabilities to potential buyers, some of whom were officially designated as enemy combatants. Think of it as a showroom, Thorne explained through their encrypted communications, where American weapons are sold to anyone with enough money, regardless of which flag they fight under. The flight across 3 states passed in tense silence, their aircraft using stealth modifications to avoid radar detection. Below them, America slept, unaware that its own military technology was being used to fight a secret war against its interests. As they approached the target, Valdez felt the familiar pre-combat clarity that had kept him alive through 4 deployments. But this mission was different. Instead of fighting foreign enemies, he was about to infiltrate an American facility run by American officials who'd made themselves enemies of everything America supposedly stood for. 2 minutes to insertion, Thorne announced. Remember, we're not here to destroy anything. We're here to document everything. The world needs to see what's being done in their name. The helicopters settled into a hover above the facility's perimeter. Through night vision optics, Valdez could see guard towers, patrol routes, security measures designed to keep secrets rather than defend strategic assets. This isn't a military base, he realized. It's a private facility with government contracts. Corporate sovereignty, Thorne replied. The next evolution of warfare. Why fight wars when you can profit from all sides of a conflict? Valdez and his team rappelled into darkness, landing in terrain that looked more like a corporate campus than a weapons testing ground. But the armed guards and restricted access zones told a different story. Moving through shadows with practiced stealth, they approached the main facility. Through reinforced windows, they could see a demonstration in progress, American military technology being showcased to representatives of governments and organizations that included several designated terrorist groups. The footage they captured would later bring down 3 defense contractors, force the resignation of 4 Pentagon officials, and expose a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of American government. But in that moment, watching American weapons being sold to America's enemies, Valdez felt something die inside him, the last remnant of faith in the system he'd served. "Getting what we need," he reported through encrypted communications, "but I don't think I'll ever feel clean again." "None of us will," Thorne replied. "That's the price of learning the truth." The extraction went smoothly, their helicopters lifting off just as facility security realized they'd been compromised. But as they flew back toward the hidden valley, Valdez knew that nothing would ever be the same. They'd crossed a line that divided the world into before and after, and there was no path back to the comfortable certainties of official service. "Welcome to Unit Designation Null," Thorne said as they touched down at their secret base, "where good soldiers go when they realize that sometimes serving your country means working against your government." In the months that followed, Valdez would learn that this was only the beginning. The network they'd discovered was vast, sophisticated, and utterly ruthless in protecting itself. Fighting it would require them to become something new, neither military nor civilian, neither official nor criminal, but something that existed in the spaces between traditional categories. They would operate in shadows, strike at targets that couldn't be reached through conventional means, and accept that they might never receive recognition for their service to the America they still believed in, hidden beneath the layers of corruption they were fighting to expose. The war for America's soul had begun, and they were now its most unlikely soldiers. But first, they had to learn how to fight an enemy that wore the same uniform, saluted the same flag, and claimed the same loyalty they'd spent their careers defending. It would be the most difficult mission of their lives, and failure wasn't just unthinkable, it was the end of everything they'd believed worth fighting for. Years later, historians would struggle to explain how a small unit of presumed dead operators managed to expose a conspiracy that had corrupted American foreign policy for decades. They would point to superior training, advanced technology, and exceptional leadership. All of these would be true, but they would miss the most important factor: the fury of soldiers who discovered that their greatest enemy wasn't foreign, but domestic, and was using their sacrifice to fund its own prosperity. Captain Lyra, Infinity, Thorne had died in the Syrian desert, shot down by her own military for discovering inconvenient truths. But from those ashes had risen something far more dangerous, a ghost with nothing left to lose and everything worth fighting for. The woman who'd taken her place wasn't bound by regulations, protocol, or the chain of command. She was bound only by loyalty to the Constitution she'd sworn to defend, even when defending it meant working outside every institution designed to protect it. The SEALs who'd been surrounded on an Afghan mountainside had thought they were being rescued. Instead, they'd been recruited into the most important war of their generation, a war that would determine whether America would survive its own corruption or become just another empire that collapsed under the weight of its betrayals. In the hidden valley that served as their base, surrounded by mountains that had witnessed centuries of conflict, Unit Designation Null prepared for a campaign that would either restore their country's honor or see them destroyed by the very system they'd sworn to serve. But they'd learned something that their enemies hadn't. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't technology or firepower, but the unshakable conviction that some things are worth any sacrifice. The real war was just beginning, and they intended to win it. 5 months after the Nevada operation, Valdez stood in the same briefing room where he'd first learned the scope of the conspiracy they were fighting. The walls were now covered with photographs, documents, and connection charts that mapped a network of corruption spanning 3 decades. Each thread represented lives lost, operations compromised, and American interests sold to the highest bidder. "Progress report," Thorne said as she entered, carrying coffee that smelled like it had been brewed in a field kitchen. Despite the underground facility's advanced technology, certain military traditions persisted. "We've identified 17 more facilities," Valdez reported. "Weapons manufacturing, intelligence processing, training camps disguised as corporate retreats. The network is bigger than we thought." Through systematic intelligence gathering and carefully planned operations, Unit Designation Null had begun mapping what Thorne called the Shadow Pentagon, a parallel military-industrial complex that operated without oversight, accountability, or loyalty to anything except profit. "Any word from Raven's team?" Thorne asked, referring to their reconnaissance unit currently infiltrating a defense contractor's headquarters in Virginia. "Radio silence for 6 hours," Valdez replied, unable to keep concern from his voice. "Either they're maintaining operational security or they've been compromised." Thorne studied the mission timeline with the analytical precision that had made her an exceptional pilot. 6 hours was within acceptable parameters for a deep reconnaissance mission, but in their line of work, acceptable parameters had a way of becoming death sentences. "We proceed as planned," she decided. "Raven's team knew the risks. If they've been compromised, abandoning the mission won't save them. If they haven't, changing course could compromise them." It was the kind of cold calculation that kept units alive and missions successful. But Valdez had learned to read the subtle tells that betrayed Thorne's emotions beneath her professional composure. The way her left hand unconsciously touched her flight suit's breast pocket, where she kept a photograph of her original squadron. The slight tightening around her eyes when discussing casualties. The measured breathing that spoke of grief held in check by necessity. "New intelligence from the Pentagon source," she continued, activating a secure workstation. "Operation Mercator is moving to final phase." The screen displayed classified documents that made Valdez's blood run cold. Operation Mercator was the network's ultimate objective, a series of coordinated attacks on American military installations, designed to look like foreign terrorist operations, but actually carried out by contractors and mercenaries in the network's employ. "They're going to attack their own bases?" he asked, struggling to comprehend the audacity of it. "Think bigger," Thorne replied grimly. "They're going to attack American bases using American weapons, then blame foreign enemies and demand increased defense spending to counter the threat. Classic problem-reaction solution. Create the crisis, control the response, profit from both sides." The casualty estimates were staggering. Potentially thousands of American service members killed or wounded in attacks designed to justify contracts worth hundreds of billions of dollars. "When?" Valdez asked. 72 hours, Thorne said, "unless we can stop it." The timeline was impossible. Unit Designation Null had fewer than 50 operators, limited resources, and enemies embedded in every level of government and military command. Stopping Operation Mercator would require them to simultaneously prevent attacks on 12 installations across 4 countries, expose the network responsible, and do it all while remaining officially dead. "We can't do this alone," Valdez realized. "We won't be alone," Thorne replied. "It's time to activate the sleepers." For 3 years, Unit Designation Null had been identifying military and intelligence personnel who discovered pieces of the conspiracy, but had been silenced, transferred, or discredited. Some had been recruited directly, others had been carefully cultivated as assets without fully understanding their role. All of them shared one characteristic: they'd retained their loyalty to the America they'd sworn to serve, even when that America seemed to have abandoned them. "How many?" Valdez asked. "Enough," Thorne said. "If they respond, if they believe us, if they're willing to risk everything for a country that might not thank them for saving it." The next 18 hours became a masterclass in covert mobilization. Across the globe, Carefully worded messages activated dormant networks of operators who thought they were out of the game. Retired Special Forces personnel living under assumed names. Intelligence analysts who'd been blacklisted for asking uncomfortable questions. Military contractors who discovered their employers' true loyalties and chosen conscience over career. One by one, they responded, not with words but with actions. Equipment caches were activated. Safe houses were prepared. Operational assets that had been dormant for years began moving into position. Status report from Phoenix Cell, announced their communications specialist, a former NSA analyst whose official death in a car accident had freed her to work against the system that had tried to silence her. 5 operators ready, she continued. Target, Nevada facility. They're in position and awaiting orders. Similar reports flooded in from around the world. Berlin, Tokyo, Sydney, Dubai. Everywhere the network had established operations, unit designation null had assets preparing to strike simultaneously. This is either the most sophisticated counterintelligence operation in American history, Patterson observed, or the most elaborate suicide pact. Probably both, Thorne replied. Any word from Raven? As if summoned by her question, their communications array crackled to life, with an encrypted transmission from Virginia. Null base, this is Raven Actual, came the familiar voice of their reconnaissance team leader. Package secured, but we've got problems. The team had successfully infiltrated the defense contractor's headquarters and downloaded their operational databases. But they discovered something that changed everything. Operation Mercator wasn't just about false flag attacks. It was about regime change. They're not just planning to kill American soldiers, Raven reported. They're planning to use the attacks to justify martial law, military control of civilian government, suspension of constitutional rights, the works. This isn't just corruption, it's a coup. The revelation recontextualized everything they'd learned over the past 3 years. The weapons sales, the intelligence leaks, the elimination of whistleblowers. It had all been preparation for this moment, when the network would reveal itself and seize control of the American government under the guise of responding to a national security crisis. Updated timeline, Thorne asked, though she already knew the answer would make their situation worse. 48 hours, Raven replied. First attacks begin at 600 Thursday morning, coordinated with congressional hearings on defense appropriations. By the time the smoke clears, they'll have emergency powers and unlimited funding to fight a war they created. Valdez looked around the briefing room at faces he'd learned to trust completely. Former SEALs, Rangers, pilots, intelligence analysts, all of them officially dead, all of them committed to preventing their country's murder by the very people sworn to defend it. Recommendations? Thorne asked, though her tone suggested she'd already reached the same conclusion he had. We can't stop 12 simultaneous attacks with the resources we have, he said. But maybe we don't have to stop them. Maybe we just have to make sure the right people know who's really responsible. Thorne nodded slowly. Full exposure operation. Hit their communications, their financial networks, their command structure. Make it impossible for them to maintain the deception. And if that doesn't work? Her smile was sharp enough to cut steel. Then we make sure that when they try to seize power, they find someone already waiting for them. The plan that emerged over the next 6 hours was audacious beyond reason and complex beyond measure. Instead of trying to prevent Operation Mercator, they would allow it to proceed while simultaneously exposing its true nature. Real-time broadcasts of the attacks, intercepted communications proving coordination, financial records showing payment to the perpetrators, everything necessary to prove that the greatest terrorist attack in American history had been carried out by American officials for American profit. We'll have one chance, Thorne warned as teams prepared for deployment. If we miss even one element, If a single transmission fails to get through, they'll have the narrative control they need to complete the coup. "And if we succeed," asked Patterson. "Then we save our country," Thorne replied simply, "and probably get court-martialed for it." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. To save America, they would have to commit acts that would be considered treason by any conventional definition. But conventional definitions had proven inadequate for the threat they faced. As teams dispersed to their assigned targets, Valdez found himself alone with Thorne in the briefing room that had become their war room. On the screens around them, real-time intelligence showed the network's final preparations for Operation Mercator. Weapons moving into position, personnel arriving at staging areas, communications protocols being activated. "Any regrets?" he asked. Thorne considered the question. While studying satellite imagery of targets they would hit in less than 24 hours. "Just one," she said finally. "I regret that it took dying to teach me how to really serve my country." Outside their hidden valley, the sun was setting over mountains that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Tomorrow, they would discover whether the American empire would survive its own corruption, or join the long list of civilizations that had collapsed under the weight of their betrayals. But tonight, in a briefing room that officially didn't exist, staffed by operators who officially weren't alive, unit designation null prepared for the most important mission in American history. The war for America's soul would be decided in the next 48 hours, and they intended to make sure the right side won.